Hey guys, I wanted to try something a little bit different with this video. I love history, especially World War II. This was sort of inspired by Undoomed's video, which you should definitely check out about the Battle of the Bulge. But I kind of wanted to put my own little take on it, since I thought my usual trippy background and all that would be inappropriate for this video. The video you will watch is from a movie called The Battle for Russia. It's a very old movie. Please go check it out. If you guys like this video, I will gladly make more like it. This one took me a lot of time to research, so you'll have to be patient for them, I guess, if you like them. Please let me know what you think. Without further ado, I give you The Battle for Stalingrad. We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. This quote from Adolf Hitler was his reasoning before invading Soviet Russia. He thought the Soviet Russia would fall as easily as it did in the First World War in the Second World War. On November 7, 1917, Vladimir Lenin overthrew the Provisional Tsarist government of Alexander Kerensky, mostly due to pressures from the First World War. So Adolf Hitler thought this would end the same way. In many ways, the Eastern Front was far more interesting and far more fascinating than the Western Front, and a lot of things stood out. On the Western Front, it was seen as a gentleman's war. It was fought with respect, but not on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was a hotbed for barbarism and hatred. On the Russian front, it was a war of atrocities and no humanity to be seen anywhere. The Germans saw this as an okay thing to do because the Russians had not signed the Hague Convention Treaty, which dictated the way that prisoners of war and combatants should be treated. Hitler saw the Bolsheviks as less than human. He treated them the same as he treated the Jews. This was all part of Hitler's plan. The savagery was an order from German high command, but the Soviet savagery was an individual decision by the soldiers on the ground. As the Germans marched to Moscow, they cut savagely through the land, pillaging and destroying everything they came across. But none of it was easy. The Russians neither gave up, they fought tooth and nail. It was a resistance that wasn't expected. The Germans thought that they were winning, but at a cost they weren't prepared for, taking losses that they were definitely unanticipated. One Russian tells of a field hospital he came across, where his platoon took the soldiers, the German soldiers, and threw them out of a second-story window to break their legs. When they were on the ground, they hosed them down and left the Germans to freeze to death in the sub-zero temperature. One German says there was a Russian tank that got hit by a shell and it was completely blown apart, but one man crawled out of the tank, missing his legs, and he was still shooting at the Nazis with this pistol. This is the kind of fanaticism the Germans were fighting against. This frightened the Germans. It was very unsettling for them. The amount of power coming from the Russian men and women fighting them was unbelievable. They were fanatics, according to the Russian soldiers. This was mostly because the Germans weren't really taking POWs. They were just killing anybody who they captured. As the Germans pushed their way to Moscow, they burned down villages that they passed, killing millions. This was a strange upping of the ante by each party to see who could be more atrocious to humans. And every time something new came up, the other side felt as if they had to push the ante and up it just to be a little bit more awful to the humans fighting. At one point, Stalin sent a letter to the German high command saying that, you know, if you treat my guys better, I'll treat your guys better. We can conduct this a little more gentlemanly. He didn't even get a response because, of course, this was all part of the plan. This is what Hitler wanted to happen. But the Germans were taking up to 50 miles a day, which is completely unheard of. But that didn't last long. Between the fanatic fighting and the logistic hard times that were coming, like one of the things was the Russian railways were slightly wider than the German railways, so that caused a huge problem, because the way they got supplies back and forth was mostly by trains. Stalin took advantage of this and moved the war activities, the factories. He had them all broken down and moved east, away from the German front, so they wouldn't be captured, because he knew it would be a while before the Germans were able to use the Russian railways. But another issue the Germans had was a lot of the power they were coming up against was things they weren't prepared for. The Russians had tanks that the Germans couldn't hurt. But the biggest problem was just the sheer number of people fighting the Nazis. They were only counting on a smaller number of men to fight, but what they got were tens of millions of men and women fighting for their homeland. When the problem started coming was September. The mud came. The mud would suck trucks up to the axles. So what was the German answer for this? Take any Russian POWs they had, throw them on the ground, and use them as a human road. But the first Russian winter, the Germans were definitely ill-prepared for. Their tanks and guns would freeze up. They weren't ready. They never got clothes for the winter either, because Hitler said that it would destroy morale, because they should have already had conquered Russia by the time winter came. Another hit to the German forces came when Stalin brought in fresh Siberian troops to fight. They were not seen battle, they were veterans, and they were fighting the already kind of worn down Germans. So this was seen as a big problem because they were ready for the snow, they're Siberian. They were ready for the winter, they had special guns that wouldn't freeze up. They were prepared. The Germans are already looking like they're not in a good position. But the worst was outside of St. Petersburg, which was then known as Stalingrad. The Nazis started their attack on Stalingrad by trying to starve the civilians out of the city. But why was this so important? Hindsight being 2020, it was the last city the Russians would defend, and it was the last city that the Germans would try to take. The Germans started firing shells into the city, destroying buildings and houses, but all it did was give the Russians cover to fight. They fought from the rubble. The German soldiers were already tired, hungry, and fighting with very low morale. And the Russians, again, were being fanatical, fighting tooth and nail for every inch. One Russian general said, "Fight so close they can't use their artillery. Hug the enemy." One German general said, quote, "The time for conducting large-scale operations was gone forever. From the wide expansions of Stepland, the war was moved to the jagged gullies of the Volga, covering hills and ravines with corpses, into the factory areas of Stalingrad, spread over uneven, rigid, gutted country, covered with iron, concrete, and stone buildings. The mile as a unit of measurement was replaced by the yard. The High Command's map was a map of the city. Every house, workshop, water tower, railway, embankment, wall, cellar, and every pile of ruins, a bitter battle was raged. Without equal, even in the First World War with its vast expenditure of munitions, the distance between the enemy's army and ours was as small as it could possibly be. Despite the concentrated activity of aircraft and artillery, it was impossible to break the area of close fighting. The Russians surpassed the Germans in their use of terrain and camouflage. They were even more experienced in barricade warfare for individual buildings." End quote. That should at least give you an idea of how dug in the Russians were. They obviously weren't going anywhere without putting up a huge fight. This was their home. The Germans wanted it, and the Russians wouldn't let them have it. Stalingrad was becoming mythic to the Russian soldiers. It can be argued Stalingrad was one of the most decisive battles in military history. Once it became apparent how important this was, the Red Army only fought harder. The battle rages from September into October. The Germans' attitude begins to change. They were optimistic starting out, but by the end of October, this was not the same case. One German wrote in his journal, quote, "September 1st. Are the Russians really going to fight on the very bank of the Volga? It's madness." September 8th. "Insane stubbornness." September 11th. "They're fanatics." September 14th. "Wild beasts." September 16th. "Barbarism. They're not men. They're devils." September 26th. "Barbarians. They use gangster tactics." The soldier went quiet for a month. No journal entry. Then October 27th, he said, "The Russians are not human. They are some sort of cast iron creature. They never get tired, and they're not afraid of anything." And October 28th, his last entry, "Every soldier sees himself as a condemned man." End quote. Do you see what I mean? The Germans saw this as some sort of cakewalk. They thought the Red Army would just be pushed down, and then Russian would be the Germans. But that's not how easily it went. In fact, that's not how it went at all. Hitler felt the same way, because on November 8th he gave a speech saying that Stalingrad was almost won. which was foolish considering how poorly the war was in his favor all over, especially in Stalingrad. Another interesting thing is the Soviets started getting American equipment from the Lend-Lease program. They started getting food. They were eating American canned food. They were wearing American clothes, driving American jeeps, and shooting American guns. This was totally another blow to the Germans because they thought the Russians were going to be ill-equipped. They weren't going to have anything to fight them off with. One more blow comes on November 9th when the Russian winter returns. Everyone who was there last year knows the hell that was coming. 2 days later, on November 11th, the 6th Army is ready for its final push. They get the Luftwaffe to airstrike. They think the Russians are done. They think they're worn out, and they're going to push all the way to the Volga River. But the Soviets are fighting back in even greater force than before. One German says, quote, "We have fought 15 days for a single house with mortars, grenades, machine guns, and bayonets. By day 3, 54 German corpses are thrown in the cellar, on the landing, and in the staircases. The front is a corridor, burned-out rooms. It's the thin ceiling between 2 floors. Help comes from neighboring houses by fire escapes and chimneys. There's an endless struggle from noon to night, from story to story. Faces black with sweat. We bombarded each other with grenades. In the middle of explosion, clouds of dust and smoke and heaps of mortar, floods of blood, fragments of furniture and human beings. Ask any soldier what a half hour of hand-to-hand combat is in such a fight, and then imagine Stalingrad, 80 days and 80 nights of hand-to-hand combat. The street is no longer measured by meters, but by corpses. Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day it is an enormous cloud of burning buildings. Smoke, it's a vast furnace lit by the reflection of the flames. When night arrives, one of those howling, scorching, bleeding nights, the dogs desperately plunge into the Volga and swim to the other bank. Stalingrad is a terror. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones can't bear it for long. Only men endure." End quote. I don't know if there's anything like this that exists today. This is insanity. One Russian platoon holds up till there are 4 people left, and they call an airstrike down on their own position, just so the enemies will get hit by the artillery as they run over. Their last words to the artillerymen were, "Farewell, comrades, we did not retreat." Another Soviet unit described an occurrence like this. "We beat off the next attack with stones, firing occasionally and using our last grenades. Suddenly, from behind a wall in the rear came the rigid grind of the tank's caterpillar tracks.